So China today is pretty homogenous, but in the past they used to have a large foreign population, and as such there was a lot of racism. I touched on this a little bit in my video on Sinocentrism. But one place it's apparent is in its characters. For instance, there was Japan. They were called the Wa, and that literally means dwarf, but it could also mean submissive. And in the Han Dynasty, they called their neighbours who would now be part of China, stuff like that. For instance, there was the Man that they called insects, and the Di, which they called dogs. And of course, there's a lot of race riots in China, some of the most famous of which were anti-Western riots in the late 19th century, and of course, between the different ethnic groups in China. But I'm going to focus on some other ones. For instance, in the early 16th century, the Portuguese managed to get entrance into Ningpo, and all reports indicated they acted pretty badly. So, soldiers and civilians rose up and massacred a couple thousand of them. But it wasn't just whites who suffered at the hand of race riots and massacres here in China. In fact, Persian and Arab merchants usually bore the brunt of them. And these attacks go back to the 8th century. During the Anti-Rebellion, for instance, they were blamed for a decline in economy. So the Chinese rose up and killed the foreign merchants, most of them were Arab and Persian. Then a century later, during another rebellion, it's estimated that around 100,000 foreigners were killed in Guangzhou, that's deep in the south. Most of them were Arab and Persian, but there were also some Jews, Christians and Zoroastrians who suffered as well. And they continued to be persecuted over the centuries. For instance, in the 14th century there was the Ispa Rebellion. Now this was a Muslim rebellion here in China, and the Persian and Arab traders were once again blamed and massacred in response. And you can see why gradually the population of Arab and Persians gradually declined here in China. Of course, there's still a lot of racial and religious persecution here in China, particularly the Africans, and there's quite a large African population in Guangzhou in the south in particular. But although there's reports of Africans arriving early on as slaves as centuries gone by, there was a large African population brought in the late 20th century under Mao. They were often given scholarships around the 60s and 70s and came here to be educated, and it wasn't a problem initially, but in the 1980s, Chinese male students started getting angry with the Africans for sleeping with Chinese women. So in 1988, here in Nanjing, after a fight broke out, hundreds of Chinese started rioting, Chinese students. They started attacking Africans, storming their dormitories and the likes. The Africans had to run to African embassies for protection. And soon this riot spread to other cities and thousands of people got involved. And as a bit of trivia, this was just a couple months before the Tiananmen Square protest, which again was largely led by students. Now, in the aftermath, more restrictions were placed on the African students and very little was done to punish the Chinese. And just to add on to the end, I haven't forgot about, I'm not ignoring stuff like the Zhonggao genocide and the countless other ethnicities within China and all their history. I'm just going to do separate videos on topics like that. This was mainly concerning foreigners here in China.